Buenos días a todos. Gracias por estar aquí. Yo soy Ana María Munar, profesora de Copenhagen Business School y una de las miembros del comité científico. Estoy encantada de poder presentar a la profesora catedrática Dianne Dredge para vosotros. Y ahora voy a pasar en inglés. La ponencia que vamos a oír ahora es en inglés. So, hello, Dianne. I'm so happy that you're here today. I have some things about Dianne that I would like to say. All of them are good, so no worries here. Dianne is a professor of tourism and tourist planning at Aalborg University. It's a Danish university, but she's originally from Australia, has a large experience in tourism, and she's one of these seldom academics that has as much practical experience as academic experience. Now, very often we see people going into academia, and then that's what we have, or actually people working in the industry. But Dianne is a person that has also 25 years of practical experience. She's one of the best in her field, I can say that, in relation to tourism and sustainability, but also tourist planning and policy. And also she's a thinker. And when I say this about being a thinker, is that Dianne is courageous. So I think one of the beautiful things that we're going to listen to today is, besides giving us an overview about what the sharing economy is also some critical perspectives and opening our minds to how can we conceptualize, how can we imagine and understand what is this phenomenon. So welcome, Dianne. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and to talk about the sharing economy. It's something that is, I think, a game changer, really, in the way that we think about tourism, both in a practical sense, but also in terms of our research and the way that we teach in universities. So I just think that there's so many implications and ramifications of the sharing economy that we really need to take a very serious look at what's happening and think about this, how it fits into a bigger picture, I suppose, because a lot of the time we actually do end up talking very specifically about particular incidences or episodes or companies, and we're forgetting this big picture. So today what I would like to talk about is actually how the sharing economy and tourism fit together in this wider sense, and what should be our, or to consider some of the responses that we might like to think about in this more global sense. So I've set the task for me today to set the scene for this conference or this seminar. I'll talk a little bit about how we're going to define the sharing economy, but I know that we will get into a lot more detail in the later sessions, so I'm just trying to give you an overview. I'll talk a little bit about the implications for tourism and also the opportunities and challenges and where we might find ways of dealing with this in a very considered and thoughtful manner. And I would like to actually couch those opportunities and challenges in terms of thinking about it in terms of industry responses, government responses, markets, responses to the markets and the way the market is changing, and also the community response. And I think all too often we focus just on this first one, you know, the response to the industry and the industrial concerns, but I think we really need to take this much broader approach here. So that's my objective today. So what is the sharing economy? Now, the sharing economy is not new. It's been around for millennia, in fact, in terms of sharing. It is something that we've done for a very long time. But it is actually this new sharing economy that is really the game changer that we're talking about in tourism. And there are many, many definitions, and there are many ways that we might be able to enter into thinking about what the sharing economy is. But essentially, these characteristics that I've got up here are those that most people have settled on as being the characteristics that are really shaping the impact that the sharing economy is having in so many sectors, including tourism. So it is about this increase in peer-to-peer transactions and the dissolution or the dissolving of those traditional structures that we've had in the tourism industry in terms of, you know, wholesalers and retailers and actors that are taking very specific roles in terms of marketing a destination, destination management, and this peer-to-peer transactions, that what they are doing is really flattening the value chain and improving awareness and the transactions across different people. So really sort of flattening that sort of hierarchical structure that we used to have. It's also about digitalisation and the massive growth in digital platforms and the variety of digital platforms, but not only the fact that these small companies, these startups, have in very few years really grown to be billion-dollar companies. And, you know, in the case of, say, Airbnb, bricks and mortar is not what they do, but they've managed to build a company that's worth billions of dollars. Likewise with other platforms. So this idea of digitalisation is really sort of being able to exponentially grow the sharing economy, and so that's another characteristics. Reduces the transaction costs and actually also decreases the cost of entry into the marketplace. So very, very small micro producers can actually be part of the economy now in ways that they couldn't before and reach markets they couldn't before. So that's really having an impact. And this rise of what we call, what we've come to know as platform capitalism. And this is really the growth of these digital companies, these startups. And even though we've kind of been focusing on the producers and the consumers, what we've seen is this growth of this new form of capitalism, which is very dynamic and very global. And the final characteristic is that risks are often borne by the producers and the consumers. So in the past, the risks of providing the product, making sure that there's enough market to, you know, make it efficient to produce and profitable, all of those aspects, and, you know, the risk that it was on, say, hotels and that sort of thing has now been moved away from the hotels, and the risk is now on the producers and the consumers. And the platform capitalists are not, the risk is actually not so much on them either. So there's this shift in risks, I suppose, as well. So that's the way that the sharing economy is characterised, and they're the characteristics that are really shaping the new ways that we have to deal with tourism in the future. Okay, so setting the scene. In terms of there is absolutely no doubt the sharing economy, it's global, it's growing really, really fast. It's supposedly going to be worth about $335 billion in 2000 globally within 2025, from about $15 billion it was worth in about 2015. So massive, massive growth. But the other thing about it, not only is it growing fast, but it's actually not place-bound. And when I talk about place-bound, it's actually not, in contrast to the traditional tourism industry, the platforms and the sharing economy is something that you can access regardless of where you are. And what it means for tourism is that tourism always used to be place-bound, and you would buy from a producer or a hotel, or you would buy a service or a product in a location and consume it in that location. But now these platforms are allowing us to consume in different locations. So our money is moving in a more liquid and global way. And I think for destinations, one of the things that we have to do is really think about how we can capture more value in destinations, because it is becoming so liquid and so fluid and that's not, you know, it's just an opportunity as much as it is a challenge. So there's very, very uneven uptake, and that's another thing that sort of concerns me. We're in the very early stages of trying to understand what's going on here with the collaborative economy. And there's been very uneven uptake across the world, and there's studies that are being done in the United States and the UK and in Europe and all sorts of places. We know that, for example, in Europe, Spain, Estonia, Portugal, Greece, Italy, are all countries that are really embracing the sharing economy much more rapidly than many other countries. And I give the case of some of the Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Sweden, for example. They're also very interested. It's not as if the collaborative or the sharing economy doesn't exist there, but it's a very different interest they have in it. So in terms of what the early research is showing us is that in these countries, Spain, Estonia, Portugal, Greece, it is actually driven out of, there's a certain necessity in terms of trying to innovate in the economy, but also particularly micro-entrepreneurs are driven by the need to supplement income and things like that. So it's no wonder that there's lots of interest in the actual production here. Whereas in Denmark and Sweden, for example, the interest is more around the sustainability angle and not so much about the economic angle, but the sustainability angle and how can the sharing economy actually produce a more sustainable lifestyle and reduce our consumption and that sort of thing. So very different drivers even within Europe. And in the US, for example, a lot of it is actually driven by price. And recent studies have shown that the market in the US, for example, is really driven. About 75% of people will entertain a transaction in the sharing economy first and foremost because of the price difference. And only 25%, for example, will actually entertain it motivated by a sustainability angle. So to reduce consumption or be more sustainable. So yeah, very, very different, and I think we're really only coming to the very early stages of understanding what the drivers and the influences are in particular countries. It is challenging the traditional tourism system in many, many ways, and as I mentioned previously, there are a number of actors in this industrial tourism system that are now starting to think, uh-oh, what's happening? And I'm not just talking about traditional hotels and taxis and things like that. I'm also talking about DMOs, for example. Because of this peer-to-peer transactions that's happening, the destination image and the marketing and the development of the presence of destinations within the tourism marketplace is actually being also subverted by these peer-to-peer transactions and the feedback that's being given in real time on social media sites. And so there's this real sense of, well, where are DMOs going and what will be their role in the future when there's a lot of other activity here. Used to be that the DMOs had much more control over the projection of their destination image and marketing. So it's really challenging our industrial system in many ways. And I think we need to really think about where that's going, not just acknowledge, but where do we want this tourism system to go in the future. It's also about shifting power from the users, from the producers to the consumers. So no longer is it about marketing a product, enticing people to come and visit your location and consume your services or your products, but now the user or the consumer has so much more power to choose where they're going to go, and it's so much harder to reach collectively these users. So I just wanted to reflect a little bit about where, in fact, the sharing economy is in tourism and where it's making its impact. I've identified here a number of locations here. In food, for example, we can go kitchen surfing, we can share a meal with local families. and that sort of thing. In terms of services, we can rent anything from a suitcase to a surfboard to a bicycle. There's health and well-being that you can access in a local destination merely by accessing one of the platforms, and you can do yoga in the morning. You can go and get all sorts of services around health and well-being and training and that sort of thing by accessing these platforms. Money in terms of just exchange rates. People will, through websites, exchange cash at when you reach a destination and you need cash in foreign currency. Travel companions, you can find any sort of travel companion that you would like. You can find somebody who will wander with you through territories and countries that you're not familiar with. You can find a nanny to look after your kids when you're flying. You can trip together in all sorts of different ways. Accommodation we probably know most about, and I guess, you know, Airbnb and the house swapping websites are probably the poster childs for the sharing economy, so they don't need too much introduction. Transport as well. Uber is probably not so much the poster child, but it's definitely in the news quite a bit. But there's also BlaBlaCar and a whole lot of different models there. And one that we haven't really thought about that I think is actually, well, it's really interesting for me because I'm in the education sector, but it is about the way that education is changing as well. And there's a lot more sharing education, which is going to have a huge impact upon how we offer, you know, our higher education programs, but what sort of education you might seek to achieve when you're travelling or in your destination. So you can get all sorts of share platforms that will provide you with educational opportunities that may in fact de-centre the role of formal education, both in the tourism industry but also for the traveller as well. And I think that's an area we've got to think a lot more about. So yes, just trying to capture where it's happening. And as you can see, it's happening in many, many different parts of the tourism system. So where's the growth in the sharing economy that's affecting tourism? Okay, so there's actually 5 areas that are growing enormously. 4 of them are here. The other one is music. I didn't put music up there because it's not so relevant to us. But the 4 areas that really are receiving the most growth are financing or staffing and tasking type sharing activities, accommodation and transport sharing. So of all of the sectors of the sharing economy that are growing, 4 out of the 5 top growing subsectors are really directly impacting on tourism. And I think that from a policy point of view, or just in terms of how we're responding to this, often what we are seeing is a very reactive and ad hoc response to particular issues that are arising. And often the responses are because governments perhaps need to feel accountable to the industry because the industry, the traditional industry, may be doing it a little bit tough. But in fact, that sort of ad hoc reactive response means that we're reacting to Uber, or we're reacting to Airbnb, or we're reacting to individual companies. And I think that actually has taken the lens off us really needing to deal with this, the sharing economy in a much more holistic sense. And so what I'm suggesting is that we actually need to think of our responses in terms of what are we going to do to and for industry, what should government be doing, what should their priorities be doing, how are we going to respond to markets and those changes in the markets, and how we're actually going to respond to the drivers in the community and the shifts in the community towards using the sharing economy. So I really think that we need to think about it on this bigger level. So I'm just going to go through each of those very quickly. But in terms of identifying the challenges and the opportunities here. So in terms of the restructuring of the industry, as I've said previously, we've got this vertical value chains in the traditional industry that are actually dissolving, and it's in its place we're getting this peer-to-peer exchange, which is expanding the horizontal value chains. And in that way, it's becoming so much more complex, and the relational characteristics are much more difficult to not only understand, but to maintain a level of control over, so that we might be able to have an industry that we can effectively market and develop products in. So it's just this, I guess, dispersion of control and responsibility for the development of tourism. And we also have these new players, mostly what I'm calling the platform capitalists, or the new startup companies that are going from strength to strength, and the value of their companies are becoming so significant, and they are really pushing out the front of what should be done and what needs to be done to address the sharing economy. And so a lot of the time these platform or these companies are also developing policy. A lot of them now have got policy arms and research arms, and they're the ones that are actually driving a lot of the policy discourse. They're probably more ahead than government in a lot of respects. So there's this whole sort of restructuring of the industry going on. Tourism businesses are either in it and finding opportunities and actively, entrepreneurially embracing the way that they can transform their businesses and increase their access to the sharing economy and all of the consumers that are in that sharing economy. There are some businesses that are out and just say, no, it's not going to happen. I can't see how we can adapt, and they're out of it. They've chosen that. And there's other companies that are waiting and seeing. And it's exciting to see the ones that have jumped in it, and particularly a lot of the traditional companies, hire companies, for example, and even hotels that are now starting up their own platforms to try and get in and compete. And I think what is more worrying is that there's quite a lot of companies that are actually waiting and seeing. And whilst that's a good sort of risk aversion strategy, I'm not sure that this is ever going to go away. It is actually something that is, it's like a rolling ball. It's getting bigger and bigger, and waiting and seeing is inertia, I suppose. It's also driven by warm and fuzzy words that are really quite difficult for the industry to counter. And some of those warm, fuzzy words I'm talking about, it's more responsible, we can have authentic relationships, it's sustainable. And even though, from a research point of view, none of these attributes have actually been studied, and there's been a proven link between the sharing economy and that it is more sustainable, it is more authentic, or it is more responsible. The jury's out. We don't know that. But nevertheless, these are the words that are being used, and they're very difficult for an industry to counter. And so what we're actually finding here is that all of the old rules about how we understood the sharing economy, the traditional economy to work, are being thrown out. We are now rethinking the role of DMOs. We are now rethinking the role of the governance structures in destination communities. And our understandings about how the industry used to work in terms of, we've got wholesalers, we've got retailers, we've got consumers out there that we have to market to. It was all a very solid, very sure framework that we had about the way that tourism was working. And now those understandings are obsolete. And I'm not sure that we've actually got anything to replace it yet. We've got a lot of information about how fast the sharing economy is growing. We've got a lot of information about particular companies and their impacts, but we really don't have anything to replace models or understandings or concepts of how our industry is going to change. So we really need to think about that. And I think that's partly the role of government and policy, but it's also, an industry responsibility as well to work together. The economic implications are absolutely huge. When you think about the logistics or the economic logics behind the sharing economy. So if, for example, we are using our idling assets more effectively, we're making things less expensive. That will put downward pressure on prices, and that will also put downward pressure on inflation. So there's about the sharing economy that actually might be not a bad thing. But the other side of the coin is that the sharing economy has often been aligned with, or it's been talked about in conjunction with this idea of it being a disruptive innovation. But a disruptive innovation is one in which an old idea or an old part of the industry is disrupted, and in its place a new industry or something replaces it. So what I'm not clear about now is what is actually replacing the old traditional industry that we had. We talk about the sharing economy, but we still haven't really got any clear idea of what this disruption innovation is leading to. And in terms of, for example, employment, that's actually quite a serious issue, because even though we're talking about the sharing economy being something that will become more sustainable, it will keep costs down, it will give consumers more choice, these are all good things, but it's actually not clear whether it will generate employment. And after all, we have an economy that needs, is based on, and the discourse behind our current economic model is to fuel growth so that we can generate employment and increase well-being. So we need to know that the sharing economy will actually produce jobs and employment if this is the way to go. Just raising some questions there. Okay, so I've jumped ahead to that point already. So along with employment, obviously, we've got some real questions about labour rights and the erosion of hard-fought labour rights that have been progressively developed and enshrined over the 20th century. And now we're seeing an erosion of this because through this peer-to-peer networking, people are driving cars or they're renting their homes, and the labour costs and the labour inputs are not actually being included in those transactions in a lot of cases. There are no, for example, I'm not aware of any collective representation for people who are actually in the sharing economy. No union, for example, is what I'm trying to say. So who's looking after those interests? And also the regulation of commerce and the regulation of production is more difficult to address because of this peer-to-peer, very fragmented production that's going on. So we've got some real sort of policy issues over that. So responses, obviously, as I've said, are ad hoc, reactive, and often very specific to particular issues that have come up, driven by very local issues. And another observation I've made is that because of the lack of real deep engagement and research and knowledge building that we have over the sharing economy to date, one of the things that's happening is we're actually just taking policies that have been introduced somewhere else and we're applying them in our own region, tinkering with them just a little bit and applying them. And I think that's actually really quite dangerous, because one of the things that I said earlier was that there's lots of different drivers in terms of the way the sharing economy is being taken up and embraced in different countries and different regions. So if you're taking a policy approach that was developed in New York to deal with their particular issues, it may not work as well, in a different region or country. And so we need to be very careful about that policy mobility and the application of responses from elsewhere. So let's talk just briefly about markets, and I really don't want to go into this in much detail because the next session will actually deal in a lot more detail with the actual change in or shifts in consumer trends. So I just wanted to really bring it up that these markets are changing, and they're changing in ways that we will find it much more difficult to deal with, much less control and shape and influence in the future from a tourism management perspective. When I was preparing this slide, the contrast really got to me. I was just recently in Iceland, and I swear, Anna, she's like a national Icelandic treasure, because on the Airbnb website, she gave a lovely woolen blanket to a young couple who stayed with her, who'd planned to get married, and she helped to arrange the wedding for them. And after I read that, I just felt I wanted to go and search out Anna too. So it's a very, very effective way of building brand and image and awareness and a driving force to go and meet these particular hosts. And then the other side of the coin is this one down here. And a couple in Calgary made international news. A couple in Calgary rented out their home this year. I think their names were Star and Wayne King. And that's what they came home to, $150,000 worth of damage. And so you get a very different things that are happening in this market. And even though in this sort of market arrangement, and even though we are talking about the fact that this relationship between hosts and travellers, between the producers and the users, is mediated and controlled through the development of feedback and trust that is developed through these feedback mechanisms, it's not. It's still problematic, as these two examples, the difference between these two examples will show. So regulating the production and the commerce on these digital platforms is very, very difficult. I imagine that actually the cost to the local authorities in Canada, when they came in and they had to get hazmat teams to actually clean up for a couple of weeks after this incident here, I imagine there's a public cost to that as well. And the final point there is about protections in safety, privacy and ownership. And all these sorts of issues are coming to the fore, particularly because governments, for example, are finding it very difficult to regulate, and particularly without the good information, there's a real problem of how they can actually regulate. So in the case of New York, they had to subpoena Airbnb to try and get some records so that they could better understand what was going on. But I don't have so much of a comment over that, but I think the issue that there is privacy concerns, there is issues about where that information goes, and information on these sharing platforms. I think we need to really think about how this is going to pan out over the long term as well. In terms of community, I think we've heard a lot about, particularly in places like New York, and I will say that Amsterdam, Paris, London, Singapore, other places, there's not so much, of a negative feel, but often this very negative feeling is really related to some very localised impacts. So in New York, it was actually about the impact on the loss of revenue from the accommodation taxes that are being collected in the accommodation sector, the formal accommodation sector. It was about impacts on the rental stock as well as the real estate market in certain areas where apparently people in lower socioeconomic areas were actually being evicted or moved out as a result of owners wanting to use their apartments for Airbnb and those sorts of sharing platforms. So I'm not sure that that's any different, for example, to coastal destinations where you actually get lots of people who want to live or rent by the coastal areas, and they displace local people who have to move more inland away from the coast. So I'm not so sure that those sorts of rental and real estate market issues are unique to the sharing economy. I think that they are probably more broadly applicable in tourism. There's nuisance impacts on neighbours about noise and partying during the week and things like that. And the impacts are being felt on traditional industry subsectors very differently. So transport and accommodation are the two ones that we're getting most of the media coverage about, but we don't know about the other impacts in other areas. Erosion of labour rights that I've said, and consumer protection. So they're the interests or the issues that are really playing out in the community sphere. But nevertheless, people are still actively engaged in a very, it's growing. The uptake is very much growing. So despite these sorts of, the coverage of these sorts of impacts. So what are the opportunities? I wanted to point out where I think that we can address some thought over the next day and a half to really think about some of these areas. The sharing economy represents, whether indeed it is or not a disruptive innovation. As I said, we need to think about whether it is or not. But nevertheless, the sharing economy, the sharing platforms, peer-to-peer consumption, there's a lot of entrepreneurialism, a lot of great ideas, a lot of innovation that's going on. And I think for destinations, it's really important to try and capture that and to bring it back down to make sure that there is impacts happening in place. So remember before when I said it's not place-bound? I think we have an obligation to think about how we can capture those impacts or those opportunities and grow them in our destinations, not just allow them to be fluid and liquid and outside and move outside. So yeah, to capture that global activity and benefit, make it benefit locally. And I wanted to point out where I think that there's been a little bit of a gap in terms of our thinking in terms of this. Entrepreneurship happens in a number of different areas. And when I was thinking about the sharing economy, there's obviously subsistence or necessity entrepreneurs who are really just in it because they need to supplement their income. But there are also transformational entrepreneurs who are thinking about new ways that they can connect new markets with their traditional business and into new markets. So they're really transforming their businesses. We have social, civic and community entrepreneurs who are thinking about how they can access new markets to bring and leverage social benefit back into their local communities. We have intrapreneurs. Intrapreneurs are people that are working within their organisations, within government, within